Good morning. It's Wednesday, December 11th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 432 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. More eye-popping headlines out of Syria. In the wake of the HTS conquest of Syria and the ouster of Bashar al-Assad's regime, Israel's been striking at former regime assets to ensure that they don't fall into the wrong hands. And we're talking about a lot of strikes here. The entire Assad Air Force destroyed. The Assad Navy gone. A bunch of other advanced platforms, and now a tangled mess of steel. All told, we're hearing about more than 350 strikes in recent days. It all seems justified to me, including the advance of IDF forces into the buffer zone on the Golan Heights. But I do have my concerns about that new HTS regime. Will they call out Israel's maneuver as a violation of Syrian sovereignty? I guess we'll find out soon enough. But for now, it appears the new rulers of Syria have their hands full just trying to maintain control of the country they just conquered. We'll keep tracking it all right here on the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest is Jay Solomon, the chief investigative reporter at Barry Weiss's The Free Press. He's a veteran reporter who previously wrote for Semaphore and The Wall Street Journal. I'm excited to have him on the program. We're going to talk about his work on both Qatar and Iran and a few other things in just a few short minutes right here at the FDD Morning Brief. There are lots of reasons to be concerned about the new leaders of Syria. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS as it's known, is an al-Qaeda affiliate group, and HTS is a client of Qatar and Turkey, two Sunni countries that have backed the Muslim Brotherhood for the last decade and counting. Sure, after the fall of the Assad regime, Iran looks a lot weaker, but it's too soon to celebrate. Multiple threats abound. Still, here's something positive to consider. The fall of the Assad regime and the rise of Qatar and Turkey as the patrons of the new Syria offers a path to normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, maybe other Sunni states too. Here's why. First, Israel just survived an Iranian onslaught on 7 fronts. Not only that, Israel seems to be winning. Hamas is toast. Hezbollah is limping. The Assad regime is gone, and Iran has no air defense. The Saudis and other Sunni states can't help but admire this, not least because the Islamic Republic of Iran is their greatest threat. But here's who else they see as a threat. Qatar and Turkey. They're the top patrons of the Muslim Brotherhood and the new power brokers in Syria. Israel is currently hammering away at the bad guys in Syria, and the Gulfis are quietly cheering from the sidelines. In short, whoever threatens the Gulf states, only Israel is willing to step in and fight. The Gulfis may not call it an alliance, but sooner or later, they all need to realize that's exactly what this is. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the Biden administration reportedly waived sanctions on Iran 3 days after the presidential election. Apparently, on November 8th, the administration issued a non-public order notifying Congress of its decision to renew a sanctions waiver granting Iran access to funds frozen in Iraq during a 7-front war that Iran has been waging against Israel and the United States across the Middle East. This is not chump change. $10 billion in electricity revenues are sitting in those accounts. The Biden administration has issued these waivers before. This latest one has a 120-day lifespan. When it expires, President-elect Donald Trump will be back in the White House. It will be up to his administration to decide whether or not to reissue the waiver. The previous Trump administration did allow this sanctions relief, but with one key difference. Iran had to keep the cash in an Iraqi escrow account, making it effectively inaccessible. I like that option a lot better. Headline 2, the Houthis targeted 5 ships in the Gulf of Aden yesterday. These were American vessels, 3 supply ships and 2 accompanying destroyers. A Houthi spokesman said that Iran-backed rebels attacked the ships as they left a port in Djibouti. The strikes, according to the Houthis, were conducted to show solidarity with the Palestinians and to protest Western operations in the region as if they needed a reason after 14 months. The previous day, the U.S. Defense Department unveiled a counter-drone strategy that includes the establishment of a new office in the Pentagon. This follows a spate of Houthi drone attacks in and around the Red Sea, which have disrupted the flow of some $1 trillion worth of goods. Yes, trillion with a T. That normally pass through the crucial waterway every year. And headline 3, American and Israeli officials are optimistic that a hostage deal is within reach. Yesterday, U.S. Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner said that negotiations are gaining momentum and that President Biden plans to send more senior aides to the region in the next couple of weeks. Former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant told White House Middle East advisor Brett McGurk that a breakthrough is possible. Another unnamed senior Israeli official told the media that he believes Hamas is ready to make a deal. Why the sudden burst of energy? Feiner said that momentum picked up when the ceasefire took hold in Lebanon. Gallant credited the momentum to Israel's military accomplishments in Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. In a Facebook post, he noted how Israel has weakened the Iranian axis, ultimately leading to the ouster of Syrian butcher-in-chief Bashar al-Assad over the weekend. But you know what I think? I think the Israelis may have the upper hand, but it probably all comes back to that Trump tweet. The incoming president said he wanted a deal done before he takes office on January 20th. That appears to have gotten the attention of the Iranian axis, as well as some of their enablers, like in Turkey and Qatar. They fear his notorious unpredictability and the fact that he killed Iran's top general back in 2020. I'm referring there, of course, to Qasem Soleimani. Okay, it's now time to bring Jay Solomon onto the program. Previously, Jay wrote for Semaphore and the Wall Street Journal. He also wrote a terrific book back in 2016 called The Iran Wars. Read that twice, actually. Recommend it. A huge amount of context for what we're watching here today. Today, Jay serves as chief investigative reporter at the Free Press, a publication launched by Barry Weiss that has gained a massive following since this war began, if not before then. So let's talk to Jay about some of the fronts in this war right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome to the FDD Morning Brief, Jay Solomon.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. All right, let's start with your assessment of the latest out of Syria. Did you see this coming? I know I didn't. What do you make of where things stand right now?
I definitely didn't see this coming. I'm still sort of amazed by a lot of Middle East watchers, just the fact that the axis of resistance, the Iranian Shiite crescent, as we call it, sort of got dismantled in just months. And this is after years of, I think, the U.S. in some ways convincing itself that it was impregnable, that it was, we had to sort of live with it rather than fight it. So my first sort of conclusion is just the amazement that what has happened. But on the other hand, I kind of share your assessment of, who's taking over. Is the HTS going to be sort of a moderate force as its founder, Jelani, is trying to, portray himself? I think a lot of people are a bit skeptical given that its roots are with Al-Qaeda. And I think a bigger part, too, is what happens to the ISIS fighters in the north. You have, in recent days since the revolution, the U.S.-backed forces, the SDF, sort of weakening with a lot of its allies pulling back. And I think the SDF has said like their first priority is survival rather than fighting ISIS. So I think you've got two parts. You've got what does HTS become? What happens to ISIS? And does this thing kind of metastasize in a few months after these initial, photos or whatever of people cheering in the streets?
I think it's a great way of breaking it down. And I got to say, I still can't guess where we go. I think a lot of it really does depend on the patrons of Qatar and Turkey, and perhaps warnings that have yet to be issued by the White House, at least publicly, to both of these patrons of the new rulers of Syria. I've said it before, they need to be put on notice that there should be no touching Israel, no touching the Kurds, no touching American forces. Everything gets left alone. And by the way, congrats for taking over the country from Bashar al-Assad. Let me pivot for a second to Iran. You're a longtime Iran watcher. That was kind of your bread and butter at the Wall Street Journal, and I know you continue to watch it closely. What is your sense of the regime's strength and its viability after this latest blow? This was a gut punch. When they lost the Assad regime, it broke up that land bridge, that Shiite crescent, as we call it. It comes after the weakening of Hamas and Hezbollah, and of course, Iran's air defenses and its potential to produce ballistic missiles. All of that was taken out back in October. So how much does the Axis have left in the tank? And do you think that the regime is going to go nuclear because it's weak?
Definitely its ability to project power is sort of been decimated. And that's such a core part of its national security. It believes that it needs to sort of reach out, similar to the Shah in some ways, reach out to protect itself. And now that it's lost these key levers, it's totally exposed. And on the nuclear front, they can expand. They've been expanding, but they don't have the air defenses to defend itself, and they know that. So I think you can already feel kind of the feelers, the outreach coming from the Iranian side. The former foreign minister, now Vice President Javad Zarif, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs raising the prospect of negotiations. The president, Pezeshkian, has done that. Sort of a lot of the Iranian kind of middlemen in the West have started throwing that out. So I think they're going to definitely try to, I think they're survival mode. They're in survival mode. They're going to try to get, start another round of negotiations with the West. I think that's going to be inevitable. The question is, does the Trump administration bite? I'd have to say it's really hard in some ways to tell exactly which way Trump is going to go. There's some real hawks in there, whether it's Secretary of State nominee Rubio, the National Security Advisor Walt. But at the other hand, there's already been stories of Elon Musk going up to New York to meet with the UN ambassador. So I think that's going to be, I personally expect when Trump comes in, there's going to be a pretty fast push from the Iranian side to negotiate, and the Europeans and, some of our Arab allies, certainly the Qataris, are going to push us to do it. So I think they're extremely weak, as you kind of showed, but I also think they've got more cards to play. They're going to dangle the nuclear threat. They're already doing that. It's still unclear to me what's going to happen to the Alawite regions of Syria. The Iranians, obviously, that doesn't help them with their land bridge, but there's still Russian air bases there. It's kind of, there seems to be a bit of a stalemate right now between the new Syrian rebels and the Russians. They haven't kicked them out yet. I think there have been some contacts. It's hard to imagine that the new regime will sort of allow air bases that were used to slaughter their people to remain. But I think there's a bit of we're still kind of waiting to see what happens to the Russians and potentially the Iranians inside Syria.
Yeah, really fascinating. I mean, you just get a sense that almost everything's frozen in time for the moment while all of the rest of this shakes out. All right, I have to ask you about this. Qatar. I know you've done a lot of work on the Qataris. You and I have talked about it a bunch. They obviously are patrons of Hamas, but they're also patrons historically of HTS. What is their strategy right now, in your estimation?
I mean, my sense is it's going to be similar to what they did after the Arab Spring when it broke out in 2011. They, along with the Turks, in some ways supported, the Muslim Brotherhood affiliated Islamist movements, whether it was in Egypt, in Libya, in Syria. They supported Jabhat al-Nusra, the precursor to HTS. So I think they'll probably pursue a similar ideological line. There have been some reports recently. There was one on the Free Press recently about how the Turks and the Qataris are sort of helping Syrian Arabs push some of the Kurdish region, push it back in the northeast through a funding of housing projects and others. So I think you're probably going to see a similar push by the Qataris to support Muslim Brotherhood affiliated organizations. And that's where, when the whole reconstruction project happens, is there going to be a pretty big split between the Turks and the Qataris. And the Qataris have a ton of money, and the Saudis and the Emiratis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, who are more wary of sort of Islamist type organization movement taking part over Syria. So I think you're probably going to see some of the same tensions that were fueled by the Arab Spring. And as you remember, there was a full breakdown between the Persian Gulf bloc, with the Emiratis and the Saudis launching that embargo against Qatar. That rift has been somewhat healed, but I think you could see it start playing out again in Syria, particularly as the reconstruction and the money starts flowing on. Like, who's going to fund who, and can the HTS really remain as a bloc? But if not, it could easily splinter again.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating. You kind of look at what's going on in the region right now. Absolutely, the Sunni states are very wary of the influence of Qatar and Turkey because of the Muslim Brotherhood influence that they promote across the region. You've got the Iranians actually, at least notionally, calling out the Turks right now. The Iranians and the Muslim Brotherhood have traditionally had a good relationship, and you got the supreme leader taking to Twitter overnight saying that he knows who's behind this and kind of implying that the Turks are the problem. So you get the Iranians versus the Gulfi Sunni states versus the Qatari, Turkish, Islamist Muslim Brotherhood front. This is a complicated situation, to put it mildly. But I do want to stay on Qatar for a second. You and I have not just talked about their influence regionally. And of course, we see that right now with the resurgence of these rebels in Syria and perhaps in other places. But the Qataris also do a massive amount of investing in the West, right? We know they plow a ton of money here in the United States. They plow a ton of money into Europe. What's the strategy? What's going on there?
I mean, it seems like a little bit of a split. If you look at Europe, there's been obviously a lot of money that was pumped into securing the World Cup, which was a big deal for them. They got there was a big scandal last year where there was cash basically sent to EU parliamentarians, which was designed, from what I read, to sort of advance visa-free arrangement between Qatar and Europe. And then there's been quite a bit of criticism about their funding of Islamist movements, organizations in France, in England, in other parts. So in Europe, it seems kind of a mix of ideological religious investments, but also just, flat out investments in, Harrods or other types of investments, football clubs. In the US, it seems to be in a lot of ways more focused on securing its security and its foreign policy. I mean, what gives Qatar the most influence in the US is that it houses Al Udeid Air Base, that they subsidize Al Udeid Air Base. And, in a lot of ways, the biggest lobby in the US for Qatar is the Pentagon, because they do, save them a lot of money. But I think certainly since 2017, when they had their brawl with the Saudis and the Emiratis, and also since 10/7, there's also been this kind of renewed investment, I would say, in the media, in think tanks, others, to sort of project support for their foreign policy, which has been obviously heavily criticized since 10/7 because of their housing and their financing of Hamas. They'll say, and I mean, there's truth to it, that the U.S. and the Israelis were behind it. They supported Hamas funding, sending money into the Gaza Strip. The U.S., certainly the Biden administration, relied heavily, and so did the Trump administration, heavily on the Qataris to negotiate with the Taliban, have a conduit to the Iranians, have a conduit to Hamas. So I think if the investments, the money is in some ways support of their worldview, their defense, and their outreach to these countries that are Islamist, and they in some ways want to help support. I guess the question I'm really looking forward now that, a year after 10/7 with the Trump administration coming in, are we going to see kind of business as usual, where we almost outsource in some ways our foreign policy in the Middle East to the Qataris, or is that going to shift? There are a lot of people in the Trump orbit who also have very close relationship to the Qataris, so it's something I don't know the answer to. But after 10/7, we have indictments out for Khalid Mashal for murder. And, it's kind of unclear to me where he is. They said they kicked out these Hamas leaders, but then they say they're coming back for more negotiations. Like, is there going to be a lot of pressure now on Qatar to hand over Hamas leaders, or these investments they've had these strong political connections, is it going to kind of continue to shelter them? So that's something I'm really going to be looking forward to watching.
Yeah, those are unbelievably complex questions, and absolutely something I'm watching. Khalid Meshal's name seems to have dropped off a bit right now. The guy that they're talking about now as the new leader, or at least the head of delegation for Hamas, is this guy, Mohammed Darwish, who's not under indictment in the U.S., not under U.S. sanctions, at least not to my knowledge. And so it might be that they've just sort of figured out that they could put some other folks in from Hamas and have them lead the delegation out of Qatar, and the bad guys stay, in Turkey, where they're, I guess, going to be a little bit safer. But I do think that the trajectory of Qatar right now, at least in my estimation, probably hinges on whether a deal gets done before January 20th, which is, of course, what Trump demanded in his tweet from a few days ago. And you get a sense that the region's scrambling. Hamas is trying to figure out how many of the hostages are alive or dead and how many they can actually produce in a deal. So I guess we're going to have to wait and see. I'm going to let you go after this question. Just wondering what else should we be watching right now? I mean, obviously, we saw a bunch of ships, Chinese vessels in the Taiwan Strait. We're watching, obviously, Russia, Ukraine. What are you tracking right now that you think really ranks among the top international stories out there as really one of the top writers at the Free Press?
I mean, to me, we wrote an article last week about, are we sort of already in World War III? Has it already started? And is Trump coming in to a conflict that's basically pitting the United States and the West against this axis of Iran, North Korea, China, and the Russians? And you can see these conflicts playing out in Ukraine, where you've got Russian forces now supported by the North Korean forces, supported by Iranian drones, Chinese tech. I mean, it really is kind of a constellation of these bad guys fighting together in Europe, which I think no one could have believed would be happening just a few years ago. You've got, the Chinese and the Russians jointly doing naval operations in the Pacific. So I think I'm kind of more looking at this overall conflict, and is Trump kind of aware of where we are? I know his son has kind of tweeted against the Biden people putting ATACMS, long-range missiles, into the Ukrainian hands because it could provoke kind of a World War III. But in a lot of ways, it's already started. And how is Trump going to address it? And which wing of his foreign policy team are going to be ascended? Is it going to be the Marco Rubios, the Waltz, the Elise Stefanik's, who do seem to realize that we're in sort of an existential global conflict? Or is it going to be, Tulsi Gabbard or Don Jr. and Tucker Carlson, who are sort of outside advisors, saying, we should be pulling back. Our presence is provocative. We should turn inward. So I think that is the biggest thing I'm going to be looking at, this potential for this global conflict, and how does Trump either kind of say we need to confront it, or say let's pack it in and turn inwards. I think that's going to be a really fascinating drama that's going to be playing out over the next 4 years.
Fascinating indeed. I have a feeling we'll be learning about our policy via tweet over the weeks or perhaps months to come. We'll leave it there. Thank you for joining us today, Jay Solomon on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague, Natalie Ekenau, authored an FDD policy brief examining Qatar's use of hundreds of fake social media accounts to prop up the work of AJ Plus, which is Al Jazeera's U.S. outlet, to manipulate online discourse on Israel. Natalie highlights that AJ Plus, which is in direct violation of social media guidelines, must also comply with U.S. law by registering as a foreign agent of Qatar. They have refused to do so since 2020. It's unbelievable what this tiny country is able to get away with. Just astounding. FDD's Ruel Marcorrect wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal highlighting how the Islamic Republic of Iran continues to take it on the chin, most recently with the collapse of the Iran-backed Assad regime in Syria. But the regime in Tehran is sure to dangle negotiations in front of incoming President Donald Trump. Ruel warns that the U.S. must proceed with extreme caution to avoid repeating the same mistakes of the Obama administration, which allowed the regime to make significant gains through negotiations without any real concessions. Finally, my colleague Sinan GD collaborated with my good friend Stephen Cook of the Council on Foreign Relations for a piece in foreign policy. They explore President Recep Tayyip Erdogan's emergence as the leader of the Muslim world following the rise of the Turkey-backed Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the fall of the Assad regime. With Tehran's influence waning and Ankara solidifying its presence in Syria, Erdogan has gained the regional power he has long sought. The Persian Empire is declining. the Ottoman Empire is rising. At least that's what it looks like at the moment. We're going to keep tracking that. And that is going to do it for today. Read our expert analysis on our website, FDD.org. Read our quick takes on X at FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels too. And support our work with a tax-deductible donation at FDD.org/invest. Remember, the end of the year is fast approaching for that contribution. Tune in Friday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Our next guest is Olivia Reingold, a staff writer at the Free Press. Olivia recently went undercover at the recent American Muslims for Palestine conference in Chicago. I guess we're having a free press kind of week. The more, the merrier, I say. See you Friday, I hope. Until then, I'm Jonathan Schanzer signing off for FDD.